Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Mind Muscle Connection podcast. Today is a solo episode, and the topic I want to talk about today is we can kind of take this two ways. Why did you not build as much muscle in your building phase as you thought? And a short building phase is not, why one short building phase is not going to have the change on your physique and numbers that most people want and would expect, right? I want to hit things from that angle. We'll also talk about some muscle building mistakes from a nutrition training perspective as well too. But again, just because lately I've had some people be like, "Hey, I did a bulk and I did it for 16 weeks and I didn't build as much muscle. I'm super frustrated. It also says my body fat is up and I lost and muscle is the same." And again, if that is something that you felt, or again, maybe you've done a building phase and you just felt like things didn't change. I'm going to hit on why that is. And again, we'll also hit on, okay, what can you do differently moving forward and just some other intricacies around that. First, so before I go into that, I do have my one-on-one coaching. And so if you are someone that maybe you've done a build in the past and it hasn't worked, or you didn't know how to do it, or you didn't execute it properly, or maybe you're someone who is scared to try that out, right? You've always been lower calorie and you're scared to do that. Or again, maybe you've been building for a while and you need to drop some body fat and you're trying to figure out how to do it efficiently. Or again, you just are at a plateau and you can't figure it out, or you just love all this stuff and you want to take things to the next level. Also love working with people who want to focus on improving overall recovery, also performance related nutrition and performance related goals as well too. And again, people that, because again, a lot of those things can stem from things like circadian rhythm disruption. And again, if you're someone that's motivated, or again, you don't necessarily have any of those issues and you just want to learn more and take things to the next level, then that's again what my one-on-one coaching is. So if you are interested in that, there's a link in the show notes, or just reach out to me on Instagram, Jeff_, and that's where I'm most active. Without further ado, let's dive into today's topic. We're going to talk today. We're going to go shift more towards a building phase type focus, right? And again, like I said, I kind of want to take two angles here of one, why a short building phase won't transform your physique, and maybe if you did a building phase, why you may not have built as much muscle as you thought you would have, right? I think we'll hit both of those angles here. So I think first, to lay the groundwork here, time out of a deficit is just as, if not more important than being in a deficit when it comes to body comp change. Yes, if we want to lose body fat, we need to be in a deficit. We need to do that. So that's going to be the quickest way to see change in your body, is to lose body fat, right? And again, we know that you need to be in a deficit, but time out of that is super important. Now, the problem, and I've talked a lot about this lately, is people tend to view this as you're either in a deficit or you're in a surplus. And I don't think we need to think of it that way. There's things that can happen all across the energy balance spectrum. In a deficit, we can gain muscle. At maintenance, we can gain muscle, and we can also gain some muscle in a surplus, right? Now, what that looks like does depend on your ability to where you're at from your genetic ceiling in terms of muscle growth, your inputs, body fat percentage, all these things are going to impact that, right? But in saying that, we do want to get out of a deficit at some point in time. If we're always trying to stick to a deficit, one, our body is going to adapt to that. It's going to be hard to actually continue to be in a deficit because the body will eventually be like, all right, we're going to downregulate processes here. And that's where people run into issues, right? That's where they have a low metabolic rate. That's where maybe they have menstrual cycle dysfunction. That's where they have trouble building muscle. They don't feel as good. They have other issues going on, whether it be autoimmune issues, hypothyroid, low testosterone, et cetera. Like all these, obviously those aren't the sole cause of that, because there's a lot of people that are not ever in a deficit. But for a lot of people that do exercise a lot, like they tend to run more on that and they're always trying to lose more weight and be in a deficit, right? So we do know that we need to be out of deficit because of those adaptations that happen there. And this can, support training. It can help with recovery. It helps with energy levels. Obviously, with muscle growth, you get more fluid flexibility because you're not trying to eat 1,500 calories year round. It can help with hormonal health and just overall quality of life. So we know that we need to be out of a deficit for some period of time. The problem, though, is people expect to see a dramatic change in their physique after one single building phase. But to make matters worse, they also are only in them for a short amount of time. Again, it's always, when can I go back to trying to be in a deficit? But again, I think I've made the point a lot lately where I think we need to reframe our, hey, you're in a deficit or a surplus, because I could see where that is going to make people tend to end up being more in a deficit. And I think that's worse for your body composition. There's different ways that we can manage these phases, but it doesn't have to be all or nothing, either a deficit or a surplus all year round, right? There's some things you can do and still be progressing outside of either of those things, right? But again, people will expect to see that change in one building phase. Hey, I never did a building phase before. Now I did one. where's all this progress that I thought I was going to see, right? And that can become problematic. And then on top of it, maybe people don't see as quick a progress as they want. So then they're not in that phase as long as they should be there. And then you can add the third one of a lot of times people's methods within it are not very great either. And that becomes very problematic there. So again, we do need to get away from this. Hey, I either need to be in a deficit and that's just fat loss, or I need to be in a surplus and that's how I'm going to build muscle. Again, we can build muscle all across the energy spectrum. Energy balance spectrum. It just depends on our inputs and all the things I mentioned earlier. Again, anytime properly executed out of a deficit is going to be positive long-term, but you can't expect to change drastically in one build phase that's under 3 to 6 months. The real value of a building phase isn't what happens in 3 months. It's what happens after several years of consistently spending time out of a deficit, if you're always doing that. But again, I always come back to the properly executed side of things. So again, I want you to now, as we dive into this, I want you to get away, as I've mentioned multiple times, from a building phase is a bulking phase. You're just gaining weight. Building phase, you can be at maintenance and we can still be focusing on in a building phase. I really like to think of a building phase as anytime we're outside of a energy deficit, anytime we're not seeing our weight trend down, anytime that we're just, again, not trying to aim for that deficit. That's essentially what a building phase is. And there's different goals that we can have within the building phase. For a lot of people, it is to build muscle, and that's probably the most common. And I definitely think that 99% of people should focus on adding a little bit more muscle. And spoiler alert here on this podcast, the amount of muscle you're going to build in 3 to 6 months is not a lot. So we do still want to try and put we want to try and put everything in our favor to be able to build muscle as often as we can, right? For a lot of people. Again, there's going to be people that are very muscular. They're probably not having this problem though, right? This is really going to be specifically for people that are having trouble building muscle and are always been trying to fat loss diets there. So again, really the real value of a building phase is that a lot of where you stack that time outside of a deficit to, again, really put your body in the best position to build muscle. And we know you can build muscle in a deficit, but it's not going to be as quickly as possible. And again, there are those adaptations that happen when you're in a deficit that can become problematic over time. So let's dive into why you need to reframe your expectations in this phase and why it's more about, we have to zoom out with this phase in particular there. So number one is muscle growth just takes time. I think people think that it's like a 1-to-1 ratio. If you do everything right, any weight you gain is all muscle. And unfortunately, that's not the case. You can't force feed muscle growth. It's just a process that takes time. And again, we can pull levers to put our body in a better position to do that. And so that's why I think it's more about our inputs that we need to focus on versus, hey, I need to gain a bunch of weight. I need to force weight gain. And that's what's good. Unfortunately, that's not going to make muscle growth more quicker, right? Yes, there is that point to where if you're consistently under eating, you're not training very well geared towards hypertrophy. We're going to talk about what that looks like later in this episode. You're not eating enough protein. Yeah, you start to do those things and you can speed up muscle growth, but there still is that point where you can't go beyond that. And even then, when you do have these things dialed in, it's still a slow process. Obviously, when you first dial those things in, it will tick up a little bit. When you first start training, that process will be a little bit quicker, but that does slow down, and it is just a slow process. And when you look at muscle gain compared to fat loss, can happen on a much quicker time scale. And so what that means is people want those quick changes. And so that's, I think, why a lot of people end up leaning towards, hey, I need to lose fat. I need to always be in a fat loss phase, because you see those quicker changes and it reinforces what you're doing there. Whereas building muscle, it's just so freaking slow. Again, even if everything is dialed in, the amount of muscle that you'll grow in say a 3 to 6 month build phase just isn't going to be a ton. You're not going to pack on 10 to 15 pounds of muscle, where you could easily drop 10 to 15 pounds in a fat loss phase that's 12 to 20 weeks. That's 3 to 6 months there, right? But in saying this though, I do want to, when you actually look at, if you're looking at actual numbers, like on a DEXA scan, or if you're just looking at actual numbers from like a scale weight perspective, it is slow and it is a slow process. But in saying this, even a small amount of muscle really can start to make a difference. We do need to be careful with that thought process as well too, right? Muscle growth is slow and it just takes time. But remember though, there is more to time out of a deficit than just building muscle. So again, we don't want to get back to this, oh, it's super slow, I'll just spend more time in a deficit. There are unique benefits of being out of deficit that we need to make sure that we are still focusing on outside of this phase. So again, we don't want to just now go back to muscle growth slow, I'll spend more time in a deficit. That's not what we're trying to do here, because like I said, there's all those benefits that we've already talked about with being out of a deficit there. But again, we have to set the expectation of, all right, if you decide to do a 16-week bulk, like how much, you're not going to gain 16 pounds of muscle in that 16 weeks, right? You're looking at, somebody's inevitably going to be like, how much? And I really hate giving specific numbers here. You're probably talking, if you did really well in 16 weeks, 2 to 3-ish pounds of lean body mass. But even that, that's just also seems like a lot as well too, right? It's hard to say because it depends on so many different things there. But again, I think if you gain 2 to 3 pounds of muscle in 16 weeks, I would be very happy with that. So there, just to give you a reference of that. And then on top of it, so now we're doing these 16 weeks. So the quicker you gain weight, the more fat gain there will be. Again, this comes back to you can't just keep gaining weight and expect it to be all muscle. It's not going to be all muscle. So weight increase does not automatically equal muscle growth. So I've gotten myself caught in this before, and I feel like a lot of people think that when they're in a bulking phase. They're like, I don't want to do a bulking phase because I'm going to have to gain a bunch of weight. No, you're actually not going to have to. And if you are doing that, you're going at it the wrong way there. So weight increase does not automatically equal muscle growth. If anything, the quicker you gain weight in a short time, which many people would do, right? They would try and push muscle growth to be quicker, or they would want muscle growth to be quicker because it's a short amount of time. So therefore, they'd want to push their weight up more consistently and quicker in that phase because it's shorter. The higher the likelihood is of gaining fat instead of muscle. As I said earlier, you can't force feed muscle growth. The goal shouldn't be to make the scale move as quickly as possible. The goal would be to create an environment that supports muscle growth over months and years. That's ultimately what we're trying to do, is we're just trying to put your body in the best position to create that environment where it's like, all right, yeah, I want to keep building more muscle here. And again, you can build muscle in deficit, but over time, that is not going to be the right environment for that. But also, while surplus can be helpful, too big of a surplus isn't going to create a better environment, right? Again, we're now just, again, as we continue to push weight gain and we do it quicker and we do it quicker over a shorter amount of time, you can be sure that it's mostly water and body fat, a little bit of muscle, but mostly water and body fat in that process. The reason I bring this up too is, like I said, most people are going to make up for that short time span to be like, hey, if I can get quicker gains in 16 weeks, I'm just going to push my scale weight up. It'd be the same thing with think of it inversely from fat loss, right? Hey, if I can lose a pound a week, hey, I'm going to try and gain a pound a week, and that's going to be all muscle. And we know that's not the case there. Again, you'll build some muscle in that, but it's going to be way more body fat. And so that's why you're going to show that you gain more body fat after a 16-week surplus. So we have to be careful with just pushing our scale weight up. The third point I want to make here, and I've been saying this, is you can still build muscle out of a surplus. Just because you aren't in a surplus or pushing weight gain doesn't mean you aren't gaining muscle. Many people can build muscle while maintaining body weight or gaining very slowly. Another approach that we can do here is, say somebody does need, say you just got out of a fat loss phase. I think it's totally fine to see your scale weight come up a little bit, anywhere from 3 to 10 pounds, maybe a little bit more depending on the person. And then once you kind of get to that, then you really just stabilize, right? Again, a lot of people think of it as hey, I need to just keep pushing weight up, when you could gain a little bit of weight and then get to a point where your body feels better post-diet. Maybe you get to a better body fat range to be more to put yourself in that right environment. But from there, you don't necessarily need to keep pushing a surplus, right? Again, we can keep body weight the same. We can gain very slowly, but we're not trying to necessarily push weight gain per se. Maybe we don't want to necessarily see your scale weight trend down, but we don't necessarily need to see it trend up. And then, like I said, the other approach is gaining for a little bit, seeing it come up for a couple weeks. And once you kind of get to that range where you feel good, performance is good, you still feel good from a body comp perspective, maybe you don't necessarily feel your absolute leanness, then you can stabilize. And then it becomes, maybe we can get a little bit more recomp where now we're not losing fat, but we're mostly gaining muscle in that process, right? Again, people think that in order to progress body comp wise, you need to either be gaining weight or losing weight, which is going to equal fat loss or muscle gain. That's just further, like, too far from the truth, right? So we don't have to always be pushing our scale weight up or down in order to see progress from a body composition standpoint. And then people also think that maintenance of weight equals maintenance of progress, and you can't make progress here. But again, this couldn't be further from the truth. To me, outside, like as I talked about earlier, outside of a fat loss phase should equal a building phase, not just when you gain weight. So again, that anytime we're not purposely, like anytime we're not in a deficit, like we're in a building phase, but it doesn't have to be a bulk and pushing weight up, because at the end of the day, when we're out of a deficit, now we're just trying to set that environment up. One, for recovery from a deficit, put your body in a great position to essentially just thrive, give it more resources, but again, create that environment to be able to build some muscle there. So again, I think the main takeaway with this is we still can build muscle outside of a deficit. Your 16-week bulk is not the end all be all to like, I have to gain as much muscle as possible in the 16 weeks and then or it's not going to happen. It's like you can still do it outside of that. And as I've been saying throughout, you can still do it in a deficit as well too. But I think one of the main things as I'm just going through my notes here on this is that it really is interesting that the only way people feel like they can progress in the only way that they put all their stock into if they're succeeding or not is if their scale weight's going up or down. And if that's not doing anything, it's like, oh, I'm just stuck, nothing's happening. And that just couldn't be further from the truth. Scale weight is helpful though. And this is where people may listen to this and be like, but you talk about scale weight all the time. And if you're a client or you've been a client, like I have you track weight. And sometimes I'm on top of people like, hey, put your scale weight in. And the biggest reason is, it can be a solid indicator of are we eating enough? Are we eating too much, or are we eating in the right amount? It just gives us more insight into somebody's caloric load. But saying that, it can get messy because if you're at maintenance, you could be building some muscle. You could still be losing some body fat, right? You could be having that simultaneous fat loss and muscle gain. If you listen to episode 730, I talk about body recomp. I go deep dive into this, how simultaneous fat loss and muscle gain really is on a it's on a spectrum. It's not an on or off switch, right? You're not simultaneously losing max muscle and simultaneously losing max fat. It's, hey, depending on where you're at, you might be building a little bit more muscle here, but you might be losing a little bit more body fat, or you might be building a little bit more muscle, but losing a little less body fat. It's on a spectrum there, but that sometimes can mask progress if you only look at scale weight there. So this kind of brings me to my next point, right? So I kind of wrap this up of, hey, building phase is not just when you gain weight. It can also be, it's just a phase where you're not in a deficit, essentially, right? And it ultimately comes down to our inputs. What are the inputs here? Because people will put so much stock into, I gained this much weight, I was in a surplus, I was bulking for 16 weeks, and they focus so much on those things. My protein was good, my macros were good, what's going on here? And it's like, those are important, but then they overlook maybe the inputs that are going to put our body in the right environment to build muscle, right? And so inputs matter in this process. So your training, your nutrition, your sleep, your stress load management, et cetera. People will overanalyze exact calorie amounts, but these are the most important factors that are going to lead to muscle growth, right? Again, the goal is to create an environment that supports muscle growth over months and years, which can be done by fueling enough plus the right inputs, and not just purposely forcing weight up or finding that magical calorie amount and having that most perfect calorie number there, right? And so what I want to kind of do here is talk about what are some of these inputs from a muscle building standpoint, because I think a lot of times if somebody is not happy with what they're doing in 16 weeks from a muscle building standpoint, you look at their training and it's, again, you're going at a process that's already slow and you're just not putting yourself in the best position to even be able to build as much muscle as you want, right? And so some things that I commonly see are, first, frequency. What does your training look like? I do shoulders and back on Tuesday. They end up kind of training like a bro split. And it's, okay, that's just not, like, that stimulus is not good enough. Like your stimulant, like you need to train each muscle group twice a week. You probably need to switch to either more full body or an upper lower split. You need to train your muscle groups 2 times a week. Right off the bat, if someone says they do a 16-week phase and building phase and they don't build as much muscle as they like, and then they tell me the training split there, I'm like, that's part of your problem right there. You're not doing the main thing that's going to build the most amount of muscle. This is across the board of building phases. Hey, I gained weight, but I just gained a bunch of body fat. What was your training look like? It's not very good. They didn't really push. They just didn't have these things in check. And it's like, people just don't understand the power of training to really, having the right inputs to really cover up any energy balance you're in, and to really cover up some, really, like I said, in any calorie energy balance that you're in. It's just very powerful in that sense there. So again, if we haven't dove into all these, but if there's one takeaway, it's, okay, you probably really need to look into your training. Just going to the gym and being consistent is not, I guess being consistent, important, going to the gym is important, but that's not everything, right? We have to make sure that there's other factors that are in check, and training is a huge one that often gets overlooked there. So we're looking at frequency. That's the first thing. You got to at least hit each muscle group 2 times per week, spread out that volume a little bit more. When I look at training for muscle growth, I think it's better to, if you can spread out that stimulus throughout your week, that's going to be better than putting it in a condensed time span, right? So again, we're looking at muscle group specific, not necessarily training, I'd much rather have somebody do like a Monday, Friday, or a Monday, Thursday versus a Monday, Wednesday. And then they have 5 days where they don't get that stimulus to that muscle, right? So trying to spread it out where possible. And this is the art of programming, right? Figuring out how you fit that in. What does that look like in your schedule to hit twice a week? Because it can get confusing if you have other goals, you have other things going on there. Not necessarily confusing, but it can just be hard to balance that out. What does that look like there? So again, really trying to spread out that stimulus, because to me, I think that's super important to, again, your total volume is important, right? But I think we can improve a slow process and make it better by spreading out that stimulus, right? It's very similar to protein intake. Yes, total protein intake for the day is most important. If you can spread it out, a little bit more timing aspect to it does start to become more important as you want to continue to push things further, right? So same thing here with the stimulus, right? How often you're doing it. So again, look at your frequency. If you're doing a split and you're also relatively newer and you don't have a lot of muscle already, I would really question that and look at getting at least to a frequency of 2 times per week there. The next thing we're kind of looking at here is intensity, right? So what does intensity look like? And this doesn't mean you just grind out every set and you go to absolute failure, but it is, hey, you need, again, the stimulus is key here to tell the body to want to build more muscle. The set needs to be fairly challenging enough. Again, that doesn't mean you have to grind every rep and you have to be sweating and you have to just chase fatigue. But again, it does need to be challenging. I always say when it comes to muscle growth, the hardest part is maintaining good enough technique, sitting with that discomfort of like your muscles are hurting, your body's all right in this, and pushing through and getting a couple reps, right? That ultimately is the most challenging thing. Generally speaking, somebody's going to miss out on one of those things, right? Maybe they get close to failure, but their technique starts to degrade. So then you're not actually taking the target muscle close to failure. Or maybe they have solid technique. They are putting tension on the muscle, but then they're like, their brain, like listen to their brain. And it's like, this has got freaking hard. I don't want to push hard. And there's some things that high stress load, sleep, there's things that can impact your ability to be able to get to that point. The brain is very interesting in that sense when it comes to fatigue and stuff like that. Nutrition plays a role in your ability to do that. So those are the main things that you'll see there, right? As to where people struggle with the intensity piece of it. And then the other thing is to be able to do that more often than not. Like I said, you don't need to always get that close all the time, but you have to get fairly close to that point if you really want to build some muscle there. And then rep ranges, right? And I have some other things here too, but I think if we really want to build muscle, like a good amount of muscle, and we want to be able to stick with it and push, and again, also get that intensity piece in there that I talked about, I think you need to spend more time in the 6 to 10 rep range. And here's where this can get challenging is that 6 to 10 rep range that's going to require fairly-ish heavy weights. You're not going to be able to grab pounds and do some burn work and get there. Again, I think some of that is fine from time to time, but the majority of your training needs to be, I just think for all the reasons I said, yes, we can build muscle at 15 reps. We can build muscle at 25 reps. But when you start to get to those higher rep ranges, it's harder to get closer to failure, right? So the thing that I talked about happens. From a brain perspective, those longer sets can just be draining and it's getting boring. I don't want to do this. You can lose focus. And then and it feels harder. So it's like just doesn't end up being the most efficient way to train, in my opinion, most of the time. Now, saying that, and then on top of it, that could just get draining over time to be like, oh shit, I got to do a freaking 25 rep set here, right? Because again, the other aspect of this is you need to do this regularly, like I was saying. So that's where I fall in that like 6 to 10 kind of range. That's that sweet spot where you can be a couple reps away from failure and still see good progress, right? It's easier to gauge that. You also don't have those long grueling sets as well too, right? So that rep range is important. I mean, I think if we do want to truly build a lot of muscle, we need to spend some time doing that. And we have to do all the things I talked about. We have to get better at the skill of that. We have to get better at sitting with some discomfort within that there. And so if you don't have access to either machines or enough weights, you can see where this starts to become problematic. I would say if you work out at home and you have your dumbbells only go up to 25 pounds, you definitely need to hit your frequency more than once a week. I'll tell you that much. You're really going to have to watch intensity. And again, it's just going to be harder, right? If you don't have access to machines and barbells and cables and things like that, it's going to make this process tougher because my next thing here is exercise selection. So exercise selection also plays a big role in this. We can look at this multiple ways. Let's take somebody who trains at home, their dumbbells only go up to say 25. We're limited in terms of exercises we can do that are going to be super effective. Again, we can still build muscle in that, right? It also depends on where you're currently at in your development, where you're currently at in terms of how much muscle your kind of genetic ceiling. But if we only have dumbbells, we're really limited on what we can do, right? Let's take back. If you just have dumbbells, you can't really do lat pull down. Your only back exercises are if you have a bench, that gives us a little bit more flexibility. But let's say you don't have a bench, then you can't really do no chest support rows or anything like that, right? So then a lot of times, not only are we going to have to go high rep, but then we're also going to have to, there's the stabilization aspect of it, right? You do a bent over row, it's holy crap, right? This is super challenging just sucks being in that position for so long, right? So you can start to see where exercise selection plays a role too, right? And this is where, again, I think machines can be very helpful here in this process. If any of these are off and we're already doing a short phase, you can just see where you're just not going to build as much muscle. You'll build some, but it'll just be slower, right? So I don't want somebody to think, oh, what's the point of doing that? You still will build some muscle. It's just going to be a lot slower, which means you're not going to notice that change as quickly, right? And you just have to understand that and account for that. But again, exercise selection also is, okay, what do you have access to? Again, we talked about some machines can be helpful, but it's also, hey, when we look at your entire program, are we doing a lot of redundant exercises? Are we doing the exercises in the way that's going to put the best tension on whatever muscle we're trying to hit, but also making sure that we minimize the other muscles that are getting hit, right? A good example of this would be, all right, somebody does a hack squat. How you set up the hack squat can make it a little bit more quad focused or a little bit more posterior chain focused, right? And so how does that fit into your entire program? There's no right or wrong way to do that. But do you end up doing things in ways that target the glutes a bit more than the quads or vice versa? And then there's no balance on there. And that will start to lead to some potential issues down the line. Another good one is chest. Do you end up doing the same variation multiple different times? And that's, hey, you'd be better doing your dumbbell bench this way, having another exercise that maybe hits more of the upper chest, right? So just like evening out where the tension is getting hit there versus like, yes, if you just do say different variations of flat press, yes, you're going to continue to hit your chest, but we could probably make that process a little bit better. And again, in the short term may not do much, but over time that is going to start to add up there. So that's the other kind of aspect of exercise selection that I'm talking about specifically there. So we spend a lot of time on that because that is super important and most people overlook that. But hey, I'm not seeing the progress I want to see, but it's like there's so many things in your training that can be improved upon. And that's really the limiting factor, not how many calories you're having there. Because again, I could argue that by improving these, no matter where you're at on the energy balance, you're likely going to start, and let's say the further these were off, and the more room you have from the current muscle mass to your sort of ceiling, the quicker muscle growth will start to speed up in that process. But again, once we get those nailed down, then we search for what's the next bottleneck because we can't just continue to train better and better. But in saying that, this does take some time, right? It takes making sure you're doing the right program, individualizing that program to you. It's making sure that you are pushing yourself, right? And then there's a skill component of it, which all takes time. It's not like you can just flip a switch. You can listen to me saying this and be like, all right, I'm good to go. It's going to take time. And that's all I can say about that. So again, the input side of things is just so important there. And that's just the training. We also have nutrition, right? Again, calories matter. Meal timing is one that just kind of gets brushed off. Again, are we spreading our protein intake out throughout the day? Are we getting some food around our training, right? So that would be another input that we would need to look at outside of just calories. You start to make that a little bit better, you're going to put yourself in a better position to build muscle, again, no matter where you're at on the energy balance spectrum there. Again, your macros, are we completely screwing that up in some form or fashion, whether it be too low protein or maybe carbs are super low or vice versa? Can we potentially improve that from a nutrition perspective? And then we have sleep, right? Circadian rhythm and sleep. Again, if you're trained pretty solid, you're pushing a surplus, but then your circadian rhythm's out of whack and you don't get good sleep, and that could have some improvements. That is going to slow down this process that is already slow to begin with. So again, we need to make sure that's in check. And then looking at your overall stress load management, right? How is that? How is your bucket too full and it's overfilling, or is there room for adaptation? Because if there's not, it doesn't matter what you do. It's that process is going to be slower because again, your bucket's overfilling and your body's more so concerned about lowering that than it is about, hey, let's add more tissue, let's add more muscle in this process. So again, you do need to make sure that overall your stress load management is in check. And again, that's the whole gamut of that's your training, that's your nutrition. And again, these are all, just think about this as all the stressors you're placing on your body. Do we have enough resources available to be able to recover from all the stress we're putting on our body? But then do we need to make sure we spend more time increasing that bucket, or is it, hey, we need to take some stressors off the body there? And again, training falls into that, nutrition stress falls into that, circadian rhythm stress falls into that, your perceived stress falls into that, right? All these things fall into that bucket there. But again, my thought is no matter what, if we're improving these inputs, again, we're just putting you in a better environment. Let's say we fix these inputs and you're in a deficit, you could still build some muscle. Obviously, is it not going to be like the next layer of that would be to put your body in an even better position to build muscle, and put you in the right environment would be to at least get to maintenance. And then for some people, it's, hey, you do need to be in somewhat of a small surplus there. So like I said, just to start up, the goal is to create an environment that supports muscle growth over months and years, which can be done by fueling enough plus the right inputs and not just purposely forcing weight up. So that again comes back to, we don't necessarily need to be in a surplus. It's more important to focus on those inputs and get those dialed in. So with all this being said, and I hit on this earlier, you still need to spend time out of a deficit regardless. So this doesn't mean you should now just fat loss diet year round because you aren't going to see massive changes in a short build. Again, there's still a ton of benefits of taking time out of a deficit. And each time you are out of a deficit plus inputs are dialed in, you're adding muscle. It's just slow, right? So think of the cumulative effect of that. Plus all the other benefits of being out of a deficit apply here. Understanding that we can still build some muscle in a deficit, it's just not going to be as good as it's a surplus, right? So again, regardless, even though this is a slow process, it's still super important to get out of the deficit there. So on top of this, if you take a DEXA or a body to measure this progress, you're going to be disappointed because muscle growth is slow and any device isn't great at picking up small changes in muscle growth. You're likely going to be disappointed in the results, especially the shorter the time frame is. So again, the shorter this time frame is, whether it's 16 weeks or less, we know it's a slow process. The amount of muscle you can build in that process, if everything is even dialed in, like we talked about, which for a lot of people, there's still some things they can work on. The amount that you're going to build is going to be small. And so any DEXA scan you get, it's just going to be hard to pick up. The DEXA is not going to be that precise to pick up every last tiny fiber that was added during that period of time. It's just not going to be able to do that. And so now we're just falling in this, like, you're getting data, but it's not really picking up on the actual change that would happen. So this is why I come back to, again, if you gain 2 to 4 pounds of muscle over several months, most body comp devices aren't going to actually pick that up. It could say it's a little bit higher, it could say it's a little bit lower. And obviously, once the muscle side of things get impacted, that's going to spit out a different body fat percentage for you there, right? And so that's why progress photos, measurements, strength improvements, performance, and long-term trends are often more useful than obsessing over one single scan there. Because again, even with DEXA, what you do going into it can drastically alter your lean body mass, right? And that's the other thing. It's measuring lean body mass, not actual muscle tissue is a part of that, but there's other things that fall under lean body mass. Glycogen falls into that. What you could do here in this situation is, and you can do this both ways, right? You get a DEXA done. I'm trying to think how this would work. So you could get it. Basically, this is how you could rig it in your favor. You get a DEXA done, super depleted, right? So you have a super low carb day the day before, hard training session on top of it, go and dehydrate it. And that's going to have your body, like your lean mass will be lower and and in turn, your body fat will be higher. So you go and do that. And then you take a DEXA, where then the next time you take it, 3-6 months later, you load up on carbohydrates the day before, you make sure you're hydrated, you don't train the day before or a couple of days leading up to it, and you're going to gain a bunch of lean body mass, right? So it's okay. You just like, that's going to be the thing that's going to dictate if that phase was successful or not. I think that's problematic. So again, we need to make sure that we're understanding how that works out. And again, I'm not anti-DEXA or anything like that. I think seeing the trends over long periods of time can be super helpful. But this is why I just come back to, like, you need to focus on your inputs. Like, those need to be the things you need to focus on. Okay, am I doing those things correctly? Like, where can I improve on that versus, okay, I've been in a deficit or a surplus for 3 weeks or 3 months, eating this calorie amount. Am I building muscle or not? It's like you're overlooking those things. You need to make sure that your focus should be on your inputs there. But again, big picture, like a single building phase is really going to change your physique dramatically. And this is especially true the shorter it is. So again, you can put this further out to 6 to 12 months. And that's better than just 16 weeks. But we still have to understand that even within that, you're not going to see this drastic change. Some people may, if they really change everything going into it. I think that's more the exception than the rule. And we need to understand what is the role of the building phase. And again, most of it is simply just getting out of a deficit, right? And multiple building phase accumulated over years is often what makes the biggest difference in your physique there, right? Because you're also going to be able to continue to change your habits, continue to improve them, improve your inputs over time. We talked about the training side of things, how important that is, and that allows you to be able to continue to build that side of things, that skill side of things. So this is actually good. I'm glad I said this before, and I was looking at my Instagram post. So somebody mentioned, they commented, so shorter bulks cuts are effective but harder psychologically. I responded, I didn't make that point here in this post, right? In this, I was just saying that a short build, 3 to 6 months or less, isn't enough time to see massive change from a muscle building standpoint. And so again, the main point I was making was that multiple building phases over years is what really builds muscle, not a single 3 to 6 month bulk. Now I'm saying this, if we're looking at, okay, if you're asking this from if we're also looking at fat loss side of things, I would say a shorter, more aggressive fat loss phase that is well adhered to and creates a larger deficit will generally be more effective from a fat loss standpoint because you're creating a larger calorie deficit and losing more fat in that time frame because of the larger deficit. But this isn't for everyone. It is case context dependent. I'm going to do an episode on rapid fat loss here soon in the next couple of weeks, so be on the lookout for that. But it usually is tougher mentally across the board, right? To have to be in a larger deficit on there. Outside of fat loss, though, I'm generally not a fan of short bulks building phases for the reasons I mentioned in this post. Muscle growth is slow, and so a short building phase often isn't enough time to see dramatic changes in your physique, right? By no means I think if that's your takeaway from this, somewhere along the lines I didn't communicate it or you just didn't understand the point very well. But if anything, I'm more so inclined to be away from shorter, quote unquote, bulks, shorter building phases, as you're just not going to see a lot of time. And then it comes back to, because I've had people ask, what if I did like a 1 week diet and then for 2 weeks? You could do that, but fat loss is going to be slower and you're probably not getting the most out of your muscle building side of things. But if we do take what I said, it depends on your body comp. And again, we can still build muscle outside of maintenance or a surplus. And so you could still build some muscle. I'm not a huge fan of that approach where you do 3 weeks on, 1 week off, 1 week deficit, 3 weeks maintenance or small surplus. I just don't think that's the most effective way to go about things. And so if anything, I'm advocating for longer times out of a deficit than saying that they're effective. But in saying that, the quicker fat loss can be effective if you can stick with it and if you can stick with it, right? And it makes sense for you with where you're at, because it doesn't always make sense for everyone. So on that side of things, like I said, it's a quicker process. And I generally want somebody to be in a deficit less in one than they would be out of one. And so in that sense, you could be a little bit quicker there. But phases outside of fat loss, you definitely don't want those to be shorter. In most situations, I think it does depend on the person in the context. I would say the one time where that would make a bit more sense But in this case, it wouldn't necessarily be a bulk. It would be more so time at maintenance, which you could just consider a diet break essentially, right? But again, this comes back to people tend to think that if they're not gaining weight or they're in a bulk, that they're not building muscle, right? But you could take someone that they have higher body fat percentage, and so they can spend in 1 year, they'll likely spend more time in a deficit because they have higher body fat percentage. Again, this all depends on, can they stick to it? What does that look like? But you may have some more diet breaks in there, which I would still consider those building phases, right? Because they're time out of a deficit. And if we're focused on our inputs, which we should be, you're going to be building some muscle in that process. Again, how much are you going to see in that time? Not a lot. But this person also will be able to build muscle out of a deficit as well, too. In that sense, like that would be the one time where you would do maybe more fat loss compared to time in a building phase, but that's all because of where you're at body fat percentage wise, and that's a lever that allows you to spend a little bit more time in a deficit there. So hope that makes sense. Hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and if you have any questions on it, you can reach out to me on Instagram, Jeff HOEHN _. And then if you found this podcast to be helpful in any way, if you could leave a rating and review, that will help more people find it. That's it for now. Talk to you guys soon.